May 29th, 1453, 3 in the morning. The air around Constantinople smells like sulfur and blood. For 53 days, the greatest city on earth has been under siege. The walls that had held for over 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls, walls that had defeated Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus Vikings, are finally giving way.
Hold the line, they are breaking through!
Under the weight of something the ancient builders never imagined. A cannon so massive, it took 60 oxen to drag it into position. And on the Ottoman side, a young man stands on a hill, watching. He is 21 years old. His name is Mehmed II. And he is about to commit an act of conquest so total, so seismic, that the entire Western world will mark it as the end of one age of history and the beginning of another. Inside the walls, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos is doing something extraordinary. He knows he cannot win. His army numbers maybe 7,000 men against 100,000 Ottoman soldiers. His city is starving. His walls are in ruin. And yet, he tears off his imperial purple robes, picks up a sword like a common soldier, and walks into the gap in the wall where the fighting is thickest. The last emperor of Rome charges into the Ottoman flood. No one ever sees him alive again. The gates of Constantinople break open. Ottoman soldiers pour through. Mehmed II, still on horseback, rides through the shattered city toward the greatest church in Christendom, the Hagia Sophia, and touches its doors. After 1,123 years of Christian rule, the city is his. But stop. Before we talk about what happened that day, before we talk about why it mattered more than almost any other battle in history, we need to go back. Way back. Because the Ottoman Empire did not begin with a siege cannon or a city. It began with a small tent on a patch of cold grassland in Central Asia, and a man named Osman, who had almost nothing except a vision. How does a nomadic tribe with no resources, no city, and no navy go from the steppes of Central Asia to the walls of the most heavily fortified city on the planet in just 150 years? How does that same empire then hold 3 continents, 36 sultans, and 600 years of history? And how does it fall, not in a single battle, but in a long, slow, painful decline that reshapes the entire modern world?
Welcome to the Studio Library. Today we examine how the masters of the 17th century used stark contrast.
Because this is one of the greatest stories in human history, and it is not one most people in the West know nearly well enough. To understand the Ottoman Empire, you first need to understand the world it was born into. And that world was chaos. In the 13th century, the Mongol conquests, and you already know what the Mongols were capable of, had shattered the established order of Asia and the Middle East like a hammer through glass. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had ruled Anatolia for 200 years, was broken. Cities were empty. Trade routes were dead. Millions were gone. And into this fractured landscape, waves of Turkic nomads from Central Asia poured westward, fleeing the destruction and looking for a new home. Among these refugees were the Oghuz Turks, a semi-nomadic people who had converted to Islam and carried with them a martial culture shaped by generations of steppe warfare. They were excellent horsemen, disciplined fighters, and, crucially, deeply ideological. Many of them understood themselves as ghazis, holy warriors fighting on behalf of Islam against the Christian world. For them, the frontier between Islamic Anatolia and Christian Byzantine territory was not just a geographical line, it was a sacred battleground. One of these groups was led by a man named Ertuğrul Ghazi.
By the Sultan's decree,
somewhere around 1231,
this land is granted
then
to
Ertuğrul
you.
and his small tribe were granted land in the borderlands of northwestern Anatolia by the weakened Seljuks, a frontier zone sitting between what remained of Islamic Anatolia and the crumbling Byzantine Empire. It was not rich land. It was not a safe land. It was the kind of land you give to a group of fighters because you want them between you and your enemy. But here is the thing about borderlands. They are where empires are made, where Ertugrul's people were placed at the most active and volatile edge of the known world, right next to an aging, weakening Byzantine Empire that could no longer defend its villages.
Charge!
Every raid into Byzantine territory was both profitable and holy. Every victory brought more recruits, more resources, and more legitimacy. The Ghazi identity was not just a religious label, it was a magnet that pulled warriors from all over the Islamic world toward this little frontier tribe. If you were a young Muslim man in the 13th century Anatolia who wanted to fight, wanted glory, and wanted meaning, you went to the frontier. You went to
the legacy
Ertugrul.
of our father.
When Ertugrul died
The
around
sword of
1281,
my
his son
father is
Osman
now
inherited
mine.
leadership of what was still a small,
I will
relatively
protect
unremarkable
our
beylik,
people.
a petty principality, one of dozens scattered across Anatolia. But Osman was different from his father in a critical way. He was not just a warrior, he was a state builder.
Push from the
He
other side.
understood
Careful,
that to
it's
create
slipping.
something lasting, he needed more than raids and battlefield victories.
We must
He
unite
needed
these
institutions,
tribes under a single
alliances,
banner if
and a
we are to
legitimizing
survive.
idea
It
larger
is
than his
Allah's
own
will,
ambition.
Chief.
Around
From
1299,
this day
though
forward,
historians debate
we
the
are
exact
no
date,
longer just a
Osman
tribe.
declared independence
We
from
are
the
a
collapsing
state,
Seljuk state.
forged in
He began minting his own coins, organizing his own administration, and styling himself not just as a tribal chief, but as a ruler in his own right. The Ottoman state, named for Osman, so whose name in Arabic was Uthman, was born. Now, here is a question worth sitting with. Why did the Ottomans succeed where dozens of other Turkic beyliks failed? Their neighbors had the same warriors, the same faith, the same access to Byzantine territory. Several of them were actually larger and better resourced than Osman's little principality. So what was the difference? The answer is almost embarrassingly simple: location and timing. The Osman's territory bordered the weakest and most tempting section of the Byzantine frontier. While other beyliks spent their energy fighting each other over barren Anatolian hills, the Ottomans had an inexhaustible enemy to their west, one that provided constant warfare, constant plunder, and constant prestige. And as the Byzantine Empire weakened year by year, the prize kept growing larger. Every victory over a Byzantine garrison made Osman more famous. Every village that surrendered added more
from the
men
plow
to his
to
army.
the sword.
The snowball was rolling,
Akbar!
and it
Long
was
live the
rolling
Sultan!
downhill toward the greatest city in the world. The Ottomans were not the strongest tribe in Anatolia. They were simply the best positioned. And in history, position is often everything. Osman died around 1326, never having captured Constantinople, the great prize that loomed to his west. But he left his son Orhan something far more valuable than a single victory: a functioning, an expanding state with genuine momentum behind it. Orhan, I moved immediately. In 1326, his forces captured Bursa, the largest Byzantine city in Anatolia, a prosperous trading hub with walls that had resisted Ottoman pressure for years. This was not a raid. This was an occupation. Orhan made Bursa his capital, began constructing mosques, markets, and caravanserais, issued his own currency, and built a proper court. In the space of a few years, the Ottomans had gone from a nomadic border tribe to a state with an actual city at its heart. What happened next is one of the most consequential geographical decisions in the empire's early history. In 1345, Orhan did something no previous Ottoman leader had done. He crossed the Dardanelles, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, and set foot on the European continent. Initially, it was military assistance to a Byzantine faction in a civil war, and Byzantine nobles were actually inviting the Ottomans into Europe to help them fight other Byzantines, which tells you something deeply sad about the state of the empire at this point. But within a generation, that foothold became colonization. Ottoman settlers followed Ottoman soldiers. The Ottomans were now, for the first time, a European power. Under Murad I, who ruled from 1362 to 1389, this European foothold became the center of gravity for the entire empire. In 1361, the Ottoman forces captured Adrianople, an ancient Roman city that had been one of the most important Byzantine strongholds in the Balkans. Murad renamed it Edirne, rebuilt it, and then, in a gesture that tells you everything about Ottoman ambition, moved his capital there. The Sultan of a Muslim empire had placed his throne in Europe, in a city that used to be Christian, with his gaze pointed westward toward more conquests. This was not a man who planned to stop, but Murad I was more than a conqueror. He was an institution builder, and the two institutions he created during his reign would define the Ottoman Empire for the next 4 centuries. The first was the Janissary Corps, the Yeniçeri, which in Turkish literally means new soldiers. To understand what made this remarkable, you need to understand what military forces looked like everywhere else in 14th century Europe. Every other monarch relied on feudal levies, farmers and craftsmen dragged from their homes, loyal primarily to their local lord, trained for perhaps a few weeks, and sent home after the campaign. They were unreliable, unprofessional, and fundamentally divided in their loyalties. The Ottomans built something entirely different, the first professional, salaried, standing army in European history. Men who existed solely to fight, trained continuously, paid regularly, and were loyal to no one except the Sultan. No feudal obligations, no competing loyalties, no land to go home to. Just soldiers. And here is where the story gets both fascinating and deeply uncomfortable by modern standards. These soldiers were not born Muslim or Turkish. They were manufactured through a system called devshirme, the gathering. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through the Christian villages of the Balkans and select young boys between roughly 8 and 20 years old, chosen based on physical and mental potential. These boys were taken from their families, not always by force, and sometimes with the family's cooperation, because the alternative path in life was grinding poverty. Converted to Islam, given Ottoman names, educated in Ottoman language and culture, and trained intensively for years. The best and brightest went to the imperial palace as future administrators, viziers, even grand viziers. The rest became Janissaries. I want to be honest about this because it's tempting to either sanitize it or sensationalize it. Devshirme was coercive. These boys had no choice. They were taken from their parents, their religion, their culture, and their identity. By any modern ethical standard, that is a profound violation of human rights. But the historical reality is more complicated than simple condemnation allows. Within the Ottoman system, these boys had access to social mobility that virtually no one else in 15th century Europe could dream of. A Janissary could rise to command armies. A Devshirme boy could become Grand Vizier, the second most powerful person in the empire. A Serbian peasant's son could end up effectively ruling from Istanbul. The system was coercive, and it was also, paradoxically, one of the most meritocratic institutions in the medieval world. That tension is real, and it deserves to be held, not resolved too quickly. The Janissaries were fanatically loyal because the empire was literally everything they had. No family waiting for them back home, no land to return to, no community remembered them. Their entire identity, their name, their religion, their language, their purpose, had been given to them by the Ottoman state, and they excelled because excellence was the only thing they had. The reign of Murad I ended on the greatest battlefield of the age. In 1389, at Kosovo Polja, the Field of Blackbirds, the Ottomans faced a coalition of Serbian, Bosnian, and Albanian forces, in what both sides understood to be a fight for control of the Balkans. The battle was enormous and brutal, and the Ottomans won decisively, cementing their hold on southeastern Europe. But Murad I was killed, stabbed, according to legend, and by a Serbian nobleman who had feigned surrender to get close enough to strike. The empire had been cemented in European soil with the blood of its sultan. By the end of the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire looked genuinely unstoppable. Bayezid I, son of Murad, inheritor of the throne, had earned the nickname Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, and he lived up to it. He moved armies with terrifying speed, expanding in all directions simultaneously. He completed the Ottoman encirclement of Constantinople, putting the great city under siege from 1394 onwards, cutting its supply lines and slowly strangling it. He crushed a massive crusade, Hungarian, French, Wallachian knights who had come to save Christian Europe at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. It was not even close. For a brief, shining, terrible moment, it seemed like Constantinople would fall a half-century before Mehmed II's cannon ever fired. And then, from the east, came someone who made Bayezid look like a warm-up act. You know Timur. You know what he built and what he destroyed. He was the most terrifying military force of the age, a man who measured his conquests in pyramids of skulls, who sacked Delhi and Baghdad and Damascus, who operated on a scale of violence that even his contemporaries found almost incomprehensible. In 1402, he turned his attention to the Ottomans. At the Battle of Ankara in July 1402, the two greatest armies of the era collided on the plains of Anatolia. The result was not close. Timur's forces, supplemented by former Ottoman vassals, whom Bayezid had alienated through decades of arrogance and territorial aggression, annihilated the Ottoman army. Bayezid himself was captured, the first Ottoman sultan ever taken prisoner in battle. He died in captivity within months, depending on the source, either from illness or from the accumulated shame of his situation. Some accounts describe Timur keeping Bayezid in a gilded cage and using him as a human footstool when mounting his horse. Whether that is literally true or a story invented by later chroniclers to dramatize the humiliation, the underlying reality was real enough. The man who had besieged Constantinople and crushed European crusaders ended his days as a prisoner of a greater conqueror. The Ottoman Empire had broken. It should have ended there. By any conventional logic of how empires work, the Ottoman state should have dissolved in 1402. Timur dismantled it, distributed the Anatolian territories back to the local Turkic beyliks that Bayezid had swallowed over the years, effectively rewinding decades of Ottoman expansion. But Timur made a critical strategic miscalculation. He did not press into Europe. The Ottoman territories in the Balkans, Edirne, the heart of their European empire, were left largely untouched. Timur was not interested in ruling Ottoman lands permanently. He wanted to punish a rival and eliminate a threat to his own supremacy, and having done that, he moved on. What followed was 11 years of Ottoman civil war, the interregnum, as Bayezid's four sons fought each other for the right to rule what remained. It was brutal, chaotic, and completely existential. The empire had no legitimate sultan, no unified command, and enemies on every side who would have loved to finish the job Timur had started. And yet, the empire survived. That survival is, I think, underappreciated in most retellings of this story. What it demonstrates is something crucial. The Ottoman state was not simply a vehicle for one man's ambitions. The institutions that had been built, the Janissaries, the Devshirme pipeline, the administrative bureaucracy, the provincial governance system, had developed enough independent momentum to keep functioning even without a sultan at the helm. The machine kept running without a driver. That kind of institutional durability is extraordinarily rare, and it is one of the genuine secrets of Ottoman longevity. In 1413, Mehmed I, one of the four sons, finally emerged victorious and unified the empire. He spent his reign carefully healing what the civil war had torn. His son Murad II then rebuilt Ottoman military dominance in the Balkans, completing the recovery with a decisive victory over a final crusade at the Battle of Varna in 1444. The Ottoman Empire had been struck by the most devastating military force of the age, had collapsed into nearly a decade of fratricidal war, and had rebuilt itself from the ruins. Which brings us to the man who inherited that rebuilt machine and used it to change the world. Mehmed II was 19 years old when he became Sultan for the second time in 1451. The first time, when he had been 12, thrust onto the throne while his father Murad II temporarily abdicated, and had immediately faced a massive crusade that nearly destroyed the empire before he was even a teenager. He had not handled it well. He had panicked, written desperate letters to his father begging him to come back, and had been essentially sidelined while the adults dealt with the crisis. The Christian courts of Europe noted all of this. They had observed the young Mehmed, nervous, overwhelmed, clearly in over his head, and they had drawn what seemed like a reasonable conclusion. This boy was manageable, not dangerous, someone they could work with, someone they did not need to fear. They could not have been more wrong about anything in their lives. The Mehmed who returned to the throne in 1451 was a fundamentally different person from the frightened 12-year-old they remembered. He had spent the intervening years reading with an obsessive, the almost unnerving focus, not just Islamic theology and Ottoman history, but Greek and Latin classics, the campaigns of Alexander the Great, the military history of Rome. He spoke 6 languages fluently, and he was consumed, in a way that bordered on mystical conviction, by a single idea. He was meant to conquer Constantinople. This was not mere military ambition. There was a hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, that the ruler who conquered Constantinople would be a blessed commander leading a blessed army. For over 700 years, Muslim rulers had tried and failed to fulfill this prophecy. Multiple Arab caliphs had besieged the city and been turned back. Bayezid I had surrounded it for 8 years and been pulled away by Timur. The walls had never fallen. And Mehmed believed, with the kind of absolute certainty that makes men either great or insane, that he was the one who would finally do it. He began preparing immediately after taking the throne. His first move was to construct a fortress, Rumeli Hisara, on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. Together, the two forts gave him complete control of the strait. Constantinople was now cut off from Black Sea supply routes. The city was being strangled before a single cannon had been positioned. Then came the artillery. Mehmed had sought out a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first approached the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI with an offer to build cannons. The emperor was interested, but could not afford Urban's price. Mehmed paid him whatever he asked. Urban then designed and cast a gun unlike anything the world had seen, a bronze monster over 26 feet long that fired stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. It required 60 oxen and 200 men to move. It could only be fired 7 times a day because the barrel needed hours to cool between shots. It took 2 months to transport from where it was cast to the walls of Constantinople. And when it finally opened fire on the Theodosian walls that had repelled every attacker for over 1,000 years, even the most skeptical Byzantine defenders understood that something had fundamentally changed. The siege began on April 6, 1453. The Ottoman force numbered somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 men. Historians debate the exact figure, but even the lowest estimate was overwhelming. The Byzantine defenders could field perhaps 7,000 soldiers, but supplemented by a small contingent of Genoese mercenaries under a capable commander named Giovanni Giustiniani, plus a handful of Venetian sailors who happened to be in port. The math was impossible, and for weeks the walls held anyway. Urban's cannon caused tremendous damage. Entire sections of the Theodosian walls crumbled under its fire. But Byzantine defenders worked through the night, every night, filling the breaches with earth and timber and rubble. The Ottoman fleet was kept out of the Golden Horn, the natural harbor protecting Constantinople's northern walls, by a massive iron chain stretched across its entrance. Every assault was repelled. The Janissaries, the most fearsome soldiers in the world at that moment, could not break through. Mehmed was running out of time. Prolonged sieges were expensive. His army was showing signs of frustration. European powers might intervene. He needed a decisive move, something that would change the fundamental geometry of the siege. On the night of April 21st, he found it. Under cover of darkness, he ordered 72 Ottoman warships to be hauled overland, dragged on greased wooden rollers across a hill nearly 2 miles long, and lowered into the Golden Horn on the other side of the chain. When Constantinople's defenders woke up the next morning, they found an Ottoman fleet inside their harbor, behind their defenses, attacking the northern walls from the inside. Think about the logistics of that operation for a moment. 72 warships, moved over land, in one night, in complete secrecy. It is not just a military maneuver. It is a declaration that Mehmed II did not recognize the limits that physics and common sense placed on other men. When he encountered an obstacle that seemed impossible to overcome directly, he simply found a way around reality itself. The psychological collapse inside Constantinople was immediate. The chain that had made the defenders feel safe had been made irrelevant. The harbor they trusted was now a front line. Morale, already fragile after 7 weeks of siege, shattered. The Genoese commander Giustiniani was wounded in early May and, controversially, chose to leave the walls to seek medical treatment, a decision his defenders called pragmatic and his critics called desertion. Either way, his departure took much of the remaining fighting spirit with him. On May 28th, Mehmed gathered his commanders. The speech he gave, as recorded by contemporary chroniclers, was essentially a declaration of inevitability. Tomorrow we take the city, or we abandon this campaign and retreat in disgrace. There would be no more waiting. The final assault would begin before dawn. At 1:30 in the morning on May 29th, 1453, the cannons opened up simultaneously along the entire length of the walls. But wave after wave of Ottoman troops attacked, first the irregular soldiers, the expendable forces, to exhaust the defenders, then the Anatolian troops, and finally, at first light, the Janissaries, fresh and ferocious, crashing into men who had been fighting for their lives since midnight. Somewhere in the chaos, a small gate called the Kerkoporta had been left unlocked, possibly forgotten in the confusion of the night. Ottoman soldiers found it. They poured through. The Byzantine defenders on the wall suddenly realized they were flanked from the inside. The line of defense, held together by exhausted men for 53 days, came apart. Constantine XI, the last emperor of Rome, threw himself into the mass of incoming Ottoman soldiers. His body was never conclusively identified. He simply disappeared into the battle and was gone, dying as he had lived. In the breach, on the wall, holding the line until there was no line left to hold, Mehmed II rode into the city on horseback. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia, dismounted, entered the greatest church in Christendom, and ordered Muslim prayers to be said immediately. He placed his forehead on the floor in prostration. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, the last direct continuation of the Roman state built by Augustus Caesar, was over. It had existed for 1,500 years. It ended that morning. Mehmed was 21 years old. I want to be direct about something here. The conquest of Constantinople is celebrated in the Muslim world as a moment of divine fulfillment and mourned in the Christian world as the death of a civilization. Both of those responses are understandable, but I think if you strip away both frameworks and look at this purely as a historical act, it is one of the most staggering individual achievements in recorded history. A 21-year-old, working with relatively limited resources compared to what previous sultans had commanded, accomplished in 53 days something that Islam had been attempting for 800 years. He did it through a combination of extraordinary military creativity, the ships over the hill, the cannon positioning, the psychological pressure, and an absolute, unshakable personal conviction that he could not fail. You do not have to approve of conquest to recognize genius when you see it. If this story is hitting the way I hope it is, drop a comment below. Tell me what you knew and what genuinely surprised you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the right moment, because we are just now getting to the part where the empire reaches heights even Mehmed never imagined. Suleiman I, the Sultan who never slept. After Mehmed II died in 1481, now the empire spent 2 relatively quiet decades under his son Bayezid II, a ruler more inclined toward poetry and religious mysticism than military campaigns. The pause was not wasted. The empire consolidated, the treasury recovered, and the administrative machine kept running. But the pause did not last. In 1512, Suleiman I seized power. He had already eliminated his brothers and their sons, entirely standard Ottoman succession practice, written into custom, if not always into law, on the logic that a dead rival cannot start a civil war. Suleiman did not apologize for this. Suleiman, as far as the historical record shows, did not apologize for anything. His nickname was Yavuz, usually translated as the Grim or the Stern. His own grand viziers were so terrified of him that it was said they maintained written wills at all times, because displeasing the Sultan could mean execution before you reached the door. In 8 years on the throne, the Suleiman reportedly had 7 grand viziers executed. His courtiers sometimes wore their burial garments to mourning audiences. The man operated at a temperature that everyone around him found difficult to survive. And yet, in those same 8 years, Suleiman accomplished more than most sultans achieve in a lifetime. In 1514, he marched east and confronted the Safavid Empire of Persia, the other great Muslim superpower of the age, but a Shia Muslim empire where the Ottomans were Sunni. The conflict between these two powers was not simply political competition. It was a schism in Islam itself being fought out in blood and fire across the landscapes of Anatolia and Persia, with civilian populations caught between 2 orthodoxies that each saw the other as heretical. At the Battle of Chaldiran, Suleiman's forces crushed the Safavids decisively, exploiting the Ottoman advantage in artillery. The Safavid cavalry considered gunpowder weapons beneath the dignity of a warrior, a cultural attitude that cost them the battle and, eventually, much of their western frontier. The Sunni-Shia divide that still drives conflict across the Middle East today was, in significant part, hardened into permanent geographic form by Suleiman's campaign. Then, in 1516 and 1517, Suleiman turned south and accomplished something extraordinary, even by his own standards. In less than 2 years, he destroyed the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria, a power that had ruled for 250 years, on a military force that had stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut. The Mamluks, formidable on horseback, had no answer for Ottoman artillery any more than the Safavids did. Suleiman swept them aside in months. With Egypt came something more significant than territory: custody of the 2 holiest cities in Islam, Mecca and Medina. The Mamluk Sultan had held the title of Caliph, the nominal spiritual and political leader of all Sunni Muslims worldwide. That title is now transferred to Selim. From 1517 onward, the Ottoman Sultan was not just a king, not just a conqueror. He was the Caliph, the leader of over 100 million Sunni Muslims around the world. The Ottoman Empire had become the Islamic Empire. Selim doubled the size of the empire in 8 years. Then he died of plague in 1520 at 49, while planning an invasion of Western Europe. His son was 26 years old when he inherited all of it. Suleiman I, the Magnificent, the lawgiver. Suleiman I is, by any serious measure, the most consequential Ottoman ruler after Mehmed II. He reigned for 46 years, the longest reign of any Ottoman sultan, and in those years he pushed the empire to its greatest geographical extent, its highest cultural achievement, and, though he could not have known it at the time, its historical peak. Everything that came after Suleiman was, in some fundamental sense, a slow retreat from what he had built. Europeans called him the Magnificent. His own subjects called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. The difference between those two titles tells you something important about the gap between how the Ottoman Empire was perceived from outside and how it understood itself from within. Europeans were dazzled by his wealth, his military power, the sheer spectacle of his court, the gold, the silk, the jeweled weaponry, the trained lions kept in the palace grounds. His own people were more interested in his legal reforms, the systematization of Ottoman civil law, known as the Kanun, which ran alongside Islamic Sharia and created a framework of secular governance that was genuinely sophisticated by the standards of any civilization on earth at that moment. Militarily, Suleiman moved with the confidence of a man who had inherited the world's greatest army and fully intended to use it. In 1521, he took Belgrade, the fortress city that had stopped Mehmed II himself. In 1522, after a 6-month siege, he expelled the Knights Hospitaller from the island of Rhodes, ending their centuries-long presence in the eastern Mediterranean and removing the last significant naval obstacle between Istanbul and the western sea lanes. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, he annihilated the Hungarian army in approximately 90 minutes of fighting. The King of Hungary drowned in a swamp while trying to flee. Within 3 years, most of the kingdom that had existed for 500 years was under Ottoman control. And then, in 1529, Suleiman besieged Vienna. Western history tends to frame this as a story of heroic defense. Vienna standing firm against the advancing Ottoman tide, civilization held at the gates by determined resistance. The reality is considerably more complicated and, I think, more interesting. Vienna did not survive because of the Austrian military genius. Vienna survived because of its distance and weather. Suleiman had marched his entire army from Istanbul, nearly 1,000 miles, through difficult terrain, arriving in September with supply lines stretched to their absolute limit and autumn rains already beginning to fall. His heaviest siege artillery had been left behind because the roads of the Balkans couldn't support it. He had 1 week, maybe 2, before the campaign became untenable. He gave Vienna those 2 weeks, concluded that he could not take the city without the equipment he didn't have, and withdrew in good order. He returned in 1532 and was stopped by the same combination of logistics and time rather than by military defeat. Vienna was saved by geography. I say this not to diminish the defenders, they fought well, but because the historical record deserves accuracy over mythology. What is genuinely underappreciated in Western accounts of Suleiman is his diplomatic sophistication. He formed a formal alliance with Francis I of France, a Christian king, against their common enemy, the Habsburg dynasty that ruled both Austria and Spain. The most Christian king of France and the Caliph of Islam, united by strategic interest against a shared rival. Suleiman found this arrangement entirely rational. He understood something that would seem obvious in any other context. Geopolitics has no permanent religious alignment. This pragmatism made him far more dangerous than any purely ideological ruler could ever be. But the story of Suleiman cannot be told without the two people who defined his personal life and, ultimately, shaped what the empire became after him. Hürrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana, began as a slave girl, probably from what is now Ukraine. Through a combination of intelligence, charisma, and political acuity that we can only partially reconstruct from the historical record, she became the first former slave ever to legally marry an Ottoman sultan, a breach of centuries of Ottoman custom so radical that contemporaries found it almost incomprehensible. She was brilliant, politically relentless, and deeply invested in ensuring that her own sons, rather than Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa, from a previous relationship, would inherit the empire. Mustafa was, by nearly all contemporary accounts, exceptional, beloved by the army, admired by the people, and everything a future sultan should be. In 1553, Suleiman summoned him to his military tent, reportedly convinced by evidence, real or manufactured, that his son was planning a coup. When Mustafa walked in, the imperial executioners were waiting. Suleiman watched through a curtain as his own son was strangled with a silk bowstring. The Ottoman army mourned openly. Soldiers wept for the prince they had expected to follow into battle. Whether Hürrem engineered this outcome, or whether Suleiman's own fear of a too popular heir drove the decision, remains one of the great unresolved questions of Ottoman history. What is clear is the consequence. The execution of Mustafa broke something in the succession system. The empire would never again produce a crown prince who had been allowed to build a genuine following among the military and the people. Future sultans would be kept in isolation, in the gilded cage of the palace, and safe from conspiracy and safe from the experience that makes rulers great. Suleiman died in September 1566 on campaign in Hungary, 71 years old and still fighting. His doctors concealed his death for days, dressing his body in its robes and positioning it to appear alive, so the army would not be demoralized before the siege ended. He had refused to die anywhere but on campaign. It was the end of an era. Not just because of who died, but because of what died with him, the unquestioned sense that the empire would always keep expanding, always keep winning, always keep producing men equal to its ambitions. After Suleiman, that certainty was gone, and empires without certainty are already beginning their long decline. Before we get to the decline, and we do need to talk about the decline, I want to stop and give you a real sense of what the Ottoman Empire looked like from the inside. Because empire is an abstraction. And the Ottoman reality was something far more textured and genuinely strange than most people realize. At its height, the Ottoman Empire administered a territory stretching from Budapest to the Persian Gulf, from the Algerian coast to the Crimean Peninsula. Under that territory lived an extraordinary diversity of peoples: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Bulgarians, Serbians, Jews, Hungarians, Egyptians, Bedouins, Berbers, Albanians, Romanians. They spoke dozens of languages and practiced at least 3 major religions with countless internal divisions. How do you hold all of that together for 6 centuries? The Ottoman answer was the millet system. Each recognized religious community, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, Jews, was granted the right to govern its own internal affairs according to its own laws and traditions. Jewish courts handled disputes within Jewish communities, so Orthodox bishops administered Orthodox populations. They collected their own internal taxes, ran their own schools, maintained their own legal traditions, and managed their own community affairs. You paid your taxes to the Ottoman state, you obeyed Ottoman military authority, and within those constraints, you were largely left to manage your own world. Was this tolerance in any modern, liberal sense of the word? No. Non-Muslims paid the jizya, an additional tax on non-believers, and faced certain social restrictions that Muslims did not. Conversion to Islam was encouraged, sometimes through social pressure that bordered on coercion. The system was hierarchical, with Muslim subjects at the top of the social order. But in an era when Spain was expelling its entire Jewish population, hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom fled directly to Ottoman territory, were where Suleiman I famously welcomed them, and when European states were burning heretics at the stake for doctrinal disagreement, the Ottoman system of managed religious pluralism looked extraordinary by comparison. It worked because it was practical. The empire needed tax revenue from its diverse subjects far more than it needed religious uniformity among them. Now let's talk about the harem, because this is one of the most persistently misunderstood institutions in all of Islamic history, and the misunderstanding is almost entirely the fault of European Orientalist fantasy. The Ottoman harem was not primarily a pleasure palace. That is a Western projection. The salacious, Orientalist image of passive, decorative women awaiting the Sultan's pleasure in silken chambers. The historical reality was something far more politically interesting, and in some ways far more modern, than that fantasy allows. The harem was a court within the court, a parallel power structure, and operating continuously, managing enormous resources and patronage networks, and exercising influence that often exceeded that of officially recognized ministers. The Queen Mother, the Valid Sultan, was among the most politically powerful individuals in the entire empire. She controlled access to the Sultan, managed the palace household budget, dispensed patronage that shaped careers across the government, and in several critical periods of Ottoman history was the person effectively running the state, while a young, ill, or incompetent sultan nominally reigned. The period from roughly 1550 to 1650, sometimes called the Sultanate of Women by historians, was not a period of imperial weakness caused by feminine influence, as later Ottoman conservatives claimed. It was a period in which capable women stepped into an institutional vacuum and filled it with genuine political competence. Sir Hürrem Sultan, Kösem Sultan, Turhan Sultan. These were operators who would have thrived in any political system in any era. Economically, the empire in its height was staggeringly wealthy, for a reason that was also, eventually, its vulnerability. It controlled the choke points of Eurasian trade. Every merchant moving goods between Europe and Asia had to pass through, or pay tribute to, Ottoman-controlled territory. Istanbul, sitting astride the Bosphorus, collected tolls on every ship moving between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Cairo controlled the Red Sea routes. Alexandria was the hub of the spice trade. The geographic advantages were compounding and self-reinforcing. The empire generated rivers of wealth not primarily through production, but through position. But here, embedded in this economic triumph, was a seed of future trouble. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and arrived in India by sea. And Europe had found a maritime route that bypassed Ottoman territory entirely. It would take decades, perhaps a century, for this shift to fully reshape Eurasian trade patterns. But the Ottoman stranglehold on the commerce of the world, one of the most fundamental sources of imperial revenue and power, had been broken. The clock had started. The empire did not know it yet. After Suleiman, the pattern of Ottoman leadership changed in a way that had consequences no one fully understood until it was far too late to reverse. The practice of keeping potential heirs confined within the palace, the cage system, designed to prevent the bloody fratricidal civil wars of earlier centuries, meant that sultans increasingly came to the throne having experienced nothing beyond the artificial, intensely political world of the Topkapi inner court. They had never commanded armies in the field. They had never administered provinces. They had never negotiated with foreign powers or dealt with the grinding reality of military logistics. They had been raised in luxury, surrounded by flattery, educated in theology and court protocol, and then handed the most complex administrative machine in the world on the day they were crowned. The results were predictably uneven. This is not to say the empire collapsed immediately. Institutional momentum is one of the most powerful forces in history, and the Ottoman system had enormous reserves of it. Capable grand viziers sometimes stepped into the vacuum left by weak sultans and drove the empire forward through sheer administrative competence. The bureaucracy kept functioning. The Janissaries kept fighting. The machine kept running. But it was running increasingly on inertia rather than direction, and inertia eventually runs out. The first major sign that something fundamental had changed came on October 7th, 1571. At the Battle of Lepanto, a combined fleet assembled by Spain, Venice, and the papacy engaged the Ottoman navy in the Gulf of Patras off the western coast of Greece. The battle was enormous, over 400 warships on both sides in one of the largest naval engagements in history. The Ottomans lost catastrophically, over 200 ships destroyed or captured, perhaps 30,000 men killed or taken prisoner. It was the first major Ottoman military defeat in over a century. The Ottomans, and demonstrating a characteristic resilience, rebuilt their navy within a year, an extraordinary display of industrial and organizational capacity, and within a decade they had recaptured Cyprus and taken Tunis. The immediate military damage was repaired, but something psychological had broken that could not be repaired. The aura of Ottoman invincibility, the belief, held by friend and enemy alike for generations, and that the Ottoman military machine was simply unstoppable, had been publicly shattered. You cannot unshatter that. The idea that the empire could be beaten was now a fact. Meanwhile, the Janissaries were becoming something very different from what Murad I had designed them to be. Success corrupted them in slow motion. By the late 16th century, they had been permitted to marry, giving them family ties and local loyalties that competed with their loyalty to the state. They had been allowed to enroll their own sons in the corps, converting an elite meritocracy based on talent into a hereditary caste based on birth. They had entered trade and business in Istanbul, making them economically independent of the state salary that had once guaranteed their compliance. And, most dangerously, they had learned through repeated experience that they could depose and kill sultans without real consequence. Between 1617 and 1623 alone, and the Janissaries overthrew or murdered 4 sultans. They became the most dangerous single power center in the empire, not because they were enemies of the Ottoman state, but because they were the state, and they had no interest in the kinds of reforms that might have saved it. Any sultan who tried to change the system they benefited from risked finding executioners in his own bedroom. The defining moment came in 1683. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led an Ottoman army to Vienna for the second time, a force of perhaps 150,000 men, the largest Ottoman military expedition into Europe since Suleiman. The scale was overwhelming. The city's modern fortifications and determined garrison could not have held indefinitely. Europe understood that this was an existential moment and assembled the largest coalition it had formed since the Crusades, a holy league of Austrian, German, Polish, and other forces under the Polish king John III Sobieski. They descended on the besieging Ottoman army from the hills above Vienna in a devastating relief charge. The Ottoman force was not just defeated, it collapsed. Kara Mustafa Pasha fled, leaving behind the imperial tent, the imperial seal, the army's war chest, and whatever remained of the empire's military mystique. He was executed on Sultan Mehmed IV's orders shortly after. The Sultan's action was politically understandable, and it could not undo what had happened. Vienna in 1683 is, in my view, the single most important turning point in Ottoman history, more significant even than any single victory. Not because of the immediate military consequences, but because of what it announced to the world, and, perhaps more importantly, to the Ottomans themselves. The empire was no longer expanding. And an empire built on the ideology of endless ghazi conquest, on the foundational idea that God's favor manifested in continuous military victory, has no philosophical framework for retreat. It can advance, or it can fall back. Vienna was the moment it definitively stopped advancing. Everything after is a long, complicated, painful story of falling back. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 delivered the verdict in writing. It was the first peace treaty in Ottoman history, signed from a position of clear military defeat, surrendering Hungary to the Habsburgs, large parts of the Balkans to Venice, and Podolia to Poland. For centuries, land had flowed in only one direction, into the empire. Now, it flowed out. The psychological impact on the Ottoman ruling class was perhaps even more damaging than the territorial loss. They had no mental framework, no ideological preparation, and no precedent for what retreat meant or how an empire continued to justify itself while losing ground. Through the 18th century, the losses accelerated with brutal regularity. Russia, under Peter the Great, then Catherine the Great, pushed relentlessly south toward the Black Sea, Ottoman territory that had been secure for 200 years. Crimea was gone by 1783. The Caucasus was contested. Each war with Russia produced another treaty, and each treaty produced another border moved southward. The empire that had threatened Vienna was now fighting desperately to hold its coasts. European diplomats coined a phrase that the sultans would have found unthinkable a century earlier: the sick man of Europe. It was meant to be contemptuous, an empire too weak to defend itself, kept alive only because the great powers of Europe couldn't agree on how to divide its corpse without fighting each other over the pieces. The phrase was accurate. The empire was on life support, and everyone knew it, except, perhaps, the patient. The Ottomans were not blind. They saw what was happening to them, and they tried, genuinely, desperately, repeatedly, to fix it. The tragedy of the 19th century is not that the Ottoman leadership refused to modernize. It is that they modernized with everything they had, and found that the problems went deeper than any reform could reach. The initial shock came from an unexpected direction. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte sailed a French army into Egypt and dismantled the Ottoman province in a matter of weeks. The Mamluk cavalry, warriors whose ancestors had stopped the Mongols, were obliterated at the Battle of the Pyramids by French infantry armed with modern rifles and organized in disciplined squares. Egypt was technically Ottoman territory. The French had just demonstrated, in front of the entire world, that the empire could not protect its own land from a Western army. Napoleon eventually left Egypt, forced out by British naval pressure, not by any Ottoman military response. That detail, if you let it register fully, tells you exactly where the empire stood relative to European military power. Sultan Mahmud II, who came to power in 1808, was the most determined and clear-eyed reformer the Ottoman throne had produced in generations. He saw, with a clarity that must have been genuinely painful, that the Janissary core was the core of the problem, a veto power on every reform, a predatory institution that had become so entrenched that it could destroy any sultan who threatened its privileges. In June 1826, Mahmud made his move. He announced the formation of a new European-style military unit. As anticipated, the Janissaries revolted, overturning their soup cauldrons in the traditional sign of rebellion, marching on the palace, declaring the Sultan deposed. But this time, Mahmud had prepared. He had pre-positioned loyal artillery around the Janissary barracks in Istanbul. When they advanced, he opened fire. The result was a massacre. Thousands died in Istanbul alone. Estimates range from 6 to 15,000. Across the empire, the suppression may have killed up to 120,000 people. Mahmud called it the auspicious incident. He abolished the Janissary Corps and replaced it with a new European-trained army. And I have complicated feelings about this moment, and I think those complications are worth naming. The Janissaries had become genuinely destructive, a parasitic caste that blocked every reform while contributing only chaos and political instability. Mahmud's action was arguably necessary. Without it, no subsequent modernization was possible. But we should also be clear about what it was. A sultan ordering the massacre of tens of thousands of his own subjects. History does not get to be made comfortable just because the people killed were, institutionally speaking, bad for the empire. That is a real tension, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. The Tanzimat reforms that followed over the next decades were sweeping by any standard. Legal equality for all Ottoman citizens, regardless of religion. Secular courts running alongside religious ones. New schools teaching modern subjects. A telegraph network. The first Ottoman newspapers. The first Ottoman railways. A professionalized civil service built on examination rather than patronage. By the 1870s, the empire even had a constitution and a parliament, the first in any majority Muslim country. But the Tanzimat arrived too late to solve the problem it was actually confronting. While Ottoman administrators were reforming their institutions, the subject peoples of the empire were discovering nationalism, the revolutionary idea that shared ethnicity, language, and culture created a right to political self-determination. The Greek independence movement had succeeded in 1829, proving to every other subject people that sustained armed rebellion, backed by sympathetic European powers, could carve territory out of the empire. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria followed in the following decades. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were the final verdict. In 2 catastrophic years of warfare, the Ottomans lost nearly all of their remaining European territory, lands they had held since Murad I in the 14th century, 500 years of presence erased in 24 months. If you had stood in the golden morning of Suleiman's reign and tried to imagine this ending, you couldn't have done it. The speed of the collapse, once it began, was staggering. This story gets darker from here. If you're still watching, and genuinely, because I appreciate you being here, subscribe so you don't miss the final act. Because the Ottoman Endgame is one of the most dramatic and heartbreaking stories in modern history, and most Americans have never heard it told in full. The Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress, came to power through a coup in 1908, promising constitutionalism, modernization, and the salvation of a crumbling state. They were young, Western-educated, fiercely ideological, and convinced that a strong, decentralized, explicitly Turkish nationalist government was the only thing that could stop the empire's disintegration. They were also, tragically, about to make the worst possible decisions at the worst possible moment in modern history. When the First World War broke out in the summer of 1914, the Young Turk leadership faced a genuine strategic dilemma. Russia was the Ottoman Empire's most dangerous enemy. It had taken the Crimea, pushed into the Caucasus, and backed every Balkan nationalist movement that had stripped territory from the empire for a century. Britain and France, the other major powers, had their own imperial interests in Ottoman territories and had demonstrated no willingness to protect Ottoman integrity when it was inconvenient for them. Germany, by contrast, was actively modernizing the Ottoman military, training its officers, and financing its infrastructure. Germany seemed, to the young Turk leadership, like the best available patron. The decision to enter the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary in October 1914 was made by a small circle of young Turk leaders, effectively in secret, without full governmental consultation. It committed the empire to a conflict on multiple fronts simultaneously against the most powerful coalition ever assembled. It was one of the most consequential and catastrophic decisions in the history of the Middle East, and its consequences are still unfolding today. The Ottomans fought on every front at once, against Russia in the Caucasus, against British-led forces in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Palestine, and against the Dardanelles campaign in 1915 and 1916. Most of these campaigns went badly, but one of them produced something remarkable. Gallipoli, the Dardanelles campaign, was a British strategic masterstroke in conception and a catastrophic failure in execution. The plan was to force open the Dardanelles Strait, take Istanbul, knock the Ottomans out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia, potentially shortening the war by years. It nearly worked. What stopped it, to a greater degree than any other single factor, was a 34-year-old Ottoman officer named Mustafa Kemal. Commanding the 19th Division on the heights above Anzac Cove, Kemal held his position against an Allied force that substantially outnumbered him, in fighting so intense that his division was nearly annihilated. He told his soldiers, in a phrase that has been remembered ever since, "I am not ordering you to attack, I am ordering you to die. In the time that passes until we die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places." They died. They held. The Allied forces, having taken catastrophic casualties over 8 months of fighting and gone essentially nowhere, withdrew in January 1916. It was the Ottoman Empire's last great military success, and it made Mustafa Kemal the most celebrated soldier in a collapsing empire. But while the world's attention was on Gallipoli, something else was happening in the eastern Anatolian provinces that I am not going to pass over or soften, because it deserves to be named directly. Beginning in April 1915, the Ottoman government initiated a systematic campaign of deportation and massacre against the Armenian population of eastern Anatolia. The official justification was military necessity, fears of Armenian collaboration with the invading Russian army, fears that had some specific factual basis in particular communities, but were wildly and deliberately extrapolated into collective punishment of an entire people. Armenian communities across Anatolia were ordered to march south towards Syria. The marches were death marches. Men were typically separated and killed immediately. Women, children, and the elderly were driven hundreds of miles across desert terrain without adequate food, water, or shelter, attacked by Kurdish irregular forces that the government had deliberately mobilized against them, shot by their Ottoman escorts, or left to die of starvation and exposure. The best available historical scholarship estimates that between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians died. Most genocide scholars working from the primary documentary record place the figure at approximately 1 to 1.2 million. Similar campaigns of massacres and forced displacement were carried out against Assyrian and Greek Christian communities in Anatolia during the same period. When the Turkish government to this day maintains that these events do not constitute genocide, arguing that the deaths were the chaotic result of wartime conditions and mutual violence rather than a deliberate policy of extermination. The majority of historians who have examined the available documentary evidence disagree, as does the majority of the international community that has taken formal positions on the question. I am not willing to treat this as a genuinely open historical debate. The evidence for systematic, government-directed extermination is extensive and well documented. I say this while acknowledging the genuine complexity of the wartime context, the chaos of the Eastern Front, the real existence of some Armenian collaboration with Russia, the violence that was happening on all sides. None of that complexity changes the historical record of what was decided and what was done to the civilian population. This is the darkest chapter in a long and complicated history, and it needs to be stated plainly. By 1918, the Central Powers had lost the war. The Ottoman Empire, exhausted, economically destroyed, having lost Egypt and Palestine and Mesopotamia to British campaigns, and having watched the Arab population of its southern territories rise with British encouragement, signed an armistice in October. The Allied powers moved immediately to enforce their wartime plans for dismemberment. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 proposed to reduce the empire to a rump state in northern Anatolia, handing large portions of the remaining territory to Greece, a reconstituted Armenia, France, and Italy. On paper, it was over. The empire that had begun with Osman's small band of ghazi warriors, that had conquered Constantinople and ruled 3 continents, that had made Europe tremble for 2 centuries, was being carved up in conference rooms in Paris by men who had never set foot in Anatolia. But one man in Anatolia was not done yet. The story of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk is, in its own way, as extraordinary as the story of Mehmed II, built on the same foundation of absolute personal conviction and military creativity, but aimed at an entirely different kind of ending. When Allied forces occupied Istanbul in 1919 and Greek troops landed at Izmir on the Aegean coast, beginning what the Greek government called the Great Idea, the restoration of a Greek Anatolia that had not existed for centuries, most of the Ottoman leadership accepted the situation as irreversible. The Sultan, Mehmed VI, was cooperating with the occupiers. Resistance seemed futile. The empire had lost the war, lost its Arab provinces, lost its European territories. What was left to fight for? Mustafa Kemal's answer was everything that was actually Turkish. He traveled to Anatolia, assembled a parallel government in the small city of Ankara, and launched what the Turks call the War of Independence, a 3-year campaign fought simultaneously on multiple fronts, against Greek forces advancing from the Aegean coast in the west, French forces in the south, and Armenian forces in the east. He was fighting with a reconstituted army, limited supplies, and no international recognition against enemies backed by the most powerful nations on earth. He won. The Greek military campaign in Anatolia, after initial advances deep into Anatolian territory, collapsed in 1922 in a catastrophic rout. The French negotiated a separate withdrawal. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 replaced the humiliating Sèvres with a negotiated peace that recognized Turkish sovereignty over the Anatolian heartland. It remains to this day one of the very few post-World War I peace treaties that was actually renegotiated by the defeated party at the point of a sword. On November 1, 1922, the Turkish Grand National Assembly in Ankara abolished the Sultanate. Sultan Mehmed VI, 36th and last of the Ottoman line, last sultan of the dynasty that Osman had founded 6 centuries earlier, fled Istanbul before dawn on a British warship, in secret, carrying what he could take with him. He never returned. The dynasty of Osman, which had begun with a small tribe on a cold borderland steppe in the 13th century and had conquered Constantinople and governed 3 continents, ended quietly, in the dark, on a boat leaving under cover of night. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was formally proclaimed. Mustafa Kemal became its first president. On March 3, 1924, the Caliphate was abolished by parliamentary vote. The spiritual leadership of the Sunni Muslim world, held by the Ottoman sultans since Selim I, took Egypt in 1517, simply ended in an afternoon session in Ankara. 600 years of Ottoman history were over. What Ataturk built on the ruins was something radically discontinuous with what had come before. A secular, westernizing Turkish nation-state that explicitly rejected the imperial, multi-ethnic, religiously defined Ottoman identity. He replaced the Arabic script with Latin letters. He abolished religious courts and replaced Islamic law with European civil codes. He banned the fez and encouraged Western dress, understanding, probably correctly, that cultural symbols carried political meaning. He gave Turkish women the right to vote in 1934, before France and before Italy. He moved the capital from Istanbul, magnificent, cosmopolitan, irreducibly Ottoman, to Ankara, a dusty Anatolian town, to make the point as physically as possible that Turkey was not continuing the empire. It was starting over. Ataturk's methods were frequently authoritarian. He imposed his reforms by decree and suppressed dissent with the tools of a one-party state. The transformation he achieved was real, but it was not gentle. That is a conversation worth having. What is not in serious dispute is the scale of what he accomplished, taking the political, institutional, and demographic wreckage of a collapsed 600-year empire and building, within a decade, a functioning modern republic. That is one of the most extraordinary acts of political creation in the 20th century, whatever you think of the man who did it. The Ottoman Empire was dead. Turkey had been built from its bones. The Ottoman Empire fell in 1923. In 2025, its consequences are still actively shaping the world you live in, arguably more so than any other collapsed empire in modern history. The borders of the modern Middle East, the lines that define Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the others, were not drawn by the people who live there. They were drawn by British and French diplomats in 1916 and 1919, in documents like the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Paris peace settlements, on top of the old Ottoman administrative structure, with deliberate disregard for ethnic, tribal, religious, and historical realities, designed entirely to serve European imperial interests. Every major conflict in the modern Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Kurdish question, the sectarian wars of Iraq and Syria, the perpetual fragility of Lebanon, has those artificially drawn Ottoman-era borders and those unresolved Ottoman-era demographic realities at its structural root. The Ottomans did not create these problems, but the way the European powers dismembered their empire created the conditions in which these problems became, for over a century, intractable. The Hagia Sophia is a single building that has lived through more history than most nations. Built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in 537 AD, converted to a mosque by Mehmed II in 1453, converted to a museum by Ataturk in 1934, reconverted to a mosque by Turkish President Erdogan in 2020, at a decision that generated international headlines and diplomatic protests. Every time its status changes, it becomes a news story, because it is not just a building. It is the physical embodiment of the question that the Ottoman story keeps forcing onto the table. Whose history is the legitimate history? Who does this place actually belong to? Whose narrative gets to be the one that's told? The Ottoman Empire lasted 624 years. That is not luck. No accident of history, no lucky streak. No single charismatic dynasty sustains 6 centuries of organized, functional governance across 3 continents. The Ottomans lasted because they built something genuinely durable, an administrative system sophisticated enough to manage radical diversity, a military system capable of recovering from catastrophic defeats, and an ideological framework compelling enough to generate loyalty across centuries. They also fell because the world changed faster than their ancient imperial framework could adapt to, outpaced by industrialization, by nationalism, by a new kind of world that their institutions were simply not built for. That is the story of the Ottoman Empire. 600 years of genius, brutality, extraordinary longevity, and spectacular collapse. A civilization that built the world you live in ways that most people in the West were never taught in school. Now you know. And I genuinely want to know what hit you hardest in this story. Drop it in the comments. This is the kind of history that deserves a real conversation. And if you want more of it, subscribe, because we are nowhere near done telling the stories that shaped the world.